they just got caught recording illegal audio. She has just completely bumbled so many things, and she has no idea what happened, and she's been trying to find it, but she's found.
Did Blake Lively's entire legal fight just collapse with one decisive move? Attorney Brian Friedman has reportedly unveiled new evidence that strikes directly at the heart of her retaliation claims, evidence so critical, it's shaking the foundation of her case. This isn't just a minor contradiction. It raises a deeper question: was Blake truly the wronged party, or has she been quietly shaping the story all along? Insiders say this latest development could shut down the case before it ever reaches trial. So now, the spotlight shifts again. Was this about justice or a calculated strategy dressed up as honesty? And in the end, did she finally expose herself?
We've seen Friedman overshoot the mark and make these big egregious statements in the press, and then it kind of doesn't really amount to anything. Because I mean, right now it's very obvious they're not suing Blake into oblivion, which was, I think, his first big, bold statement. And I think too many times have we really built up this faith in them that they've kind of under-delivered on, and now we're just kind of in this lull of, Blake's dragging us along. And I don't know if, I know Perez was really confident that he thinks that this could potentially lead to a settlement between the two of them, but I don't know. I feel like Blake kind of has to go to trial, otherwise she's going to look like a total, idiot, and I feel like Baldoni has to go to trial in order to prove.
What happens when the very evidence meant to prove your case turns out to be illegal from the start? That's the question now shadowing Blake Lively's legal team, as the focus shifts from the courtroom arguments to the way their evidence was actually obtained. The bombshell allegation: her attorneys are accused of secretly recording a private conversation with Steve Sitz without his consent, and in California, that's not just risky, it's potentially unlawful. The state's two-party consent rule is clear. Every person involved must know and agree before a recording begins. If that line was crossed, one impulsive move could destroy the credibility of Lively's entire retaliation case before it ever reaches a jury. But this isn't only about legality. It's about control and presentation. Reports now suggest her team didn't release the full recording. Instead, they allegedly quoted select fragments in a public filing, framing those clips as if they represented the entire exchange. Anyone familiar with selective editing knows the danger. A few trimmed sentences can flip a narrative, shift blame, and turn partial context into what looks like proof. It's like hearing a single heated moment from a long argument and deciding who's guilty before hearing the rest. That's the core criticism now surrounding Lively's camp. Meanwhile, Sitz's team is firing back hard. They've demanded the complete audio be made public, accusing her lawyers of cherry-picking sound bites to manipulate the story. Their challenge is blunt: release everything and let the truth speak for itself. The stakes couldn't be higher. If that recording was truly captured without consent, and if it was selectively presented, the fallout could extend far beyond bad optics. Lively could face legal exposure under state law, while her entire retaliation claim risks collapsing under its own weight. Yet, despite mounting pressure, her team continues to push to keep Exhibit 1 sealed, citing fear of media backlash rather than a legal necessity. That decision has only deepened public suspicion. Because if the full audio really supports her claims, why hide it? Why depend on edited transcripts instead of transparency? In court, partial truths often do more harm than silence, and Exhibit 1 is starting to look less like evidence and more like a cover. Enter Brian Friedman. He and his team argue that this supposed smoking gun doesn't validate Lively's case at all, it dismantles it. They say it reveals manipulation, not misconduct, and if a judge rules the evidence inadmissible because of how it was gathered, her entire retaliation narrative could collapse before trial even begins. The real irony: the most damaging part may not be the illegality itself, but what the full, unsealed recording might expose. Contradictions powerful enough to unravel the foundation of her entire case.
Of all ironies, it turns out Blake Lively's been using illegal audio to cherry pick quotes against the Wayfarer parties, because of course she is. This one's a doozy. I got to get into this. And then we're also going to talk about retaliation claims that are falling apart, so stay tuned for that. But first, let's get to this is juicy. On Wednesday, Wayfarer asked for evidence submitted by Blake to be unsealed, specifically the audio tape of Steve Sarowitz. Now, as you'll see here in this second paragraph, the materials concern an alleged recording made by the witness of a conversation with defendant Steve Sarowitz without his consent. Plaintiff seeks to seal the audio recording in its entirety, although she purported to selectively quote from it a portion of her inner brief in the public unsealed version she filed with the court. Lively boldly claims she placed the substance of the relevant information from Exhibit 1 in the public record, flatly ignoring that the person recorded was without his consent. Mr. Sarowitz should be allowed to have the entire recording made public to ensure accuracy and provide context. Basically, he's like, no, girl. You're going to try to defame me? Play it all. I'm not asking you to hide that. You don't get to decide what to protect here. You just tried to expose me by cherry picking one piece of that audio. Release it all, girl. Let's hear it all in context. Why are you doing that? Good question. Good on Steve and the team for finally pushing.
Why is a single audio recording being treated like a weapon in court? That question now dominates the ongoing legal battle as all focus turns to Exhibit 1, the piece of evidence at the heart of Blake Lively's retaliation case. Her legal team used selective excerpts from the recording in official filings to reinforce her claims, but Brian Friedman has sharply challenged its integrity, labeling it incomplete, misleading, and potentially unlawful. What began as a supporting document has now become the centerpiece of a high-stakes courtroom clash. The dispute centers on presentation. Lively's lawyers quoted sections that favored her narrative while withholding the full recording, prompting accusations that the context was deliberately altered to misrepresent the exchange. The defense argues that transparency, not secrecy, is the only path to truth. The conflict deepened when it was revealed that Lively's team quietly introduced the recording earlier this year, framing it as proof of hostile behavior. The defense immediately countered, citing California's strict two-party consent law, which requires all participants to approve any recording, a rule that, if violated, could render her evidence illegal and inadmissible. Beyond legality, however, lies the question of credibility. Insiders suggest the unedited version may actually contradict Lively's selective quotes, exposing inconsistencies in her timeline and weakening her overall case. It's a scenario where a few carefully chosen snippets could imply one story while the full audio tells another. That's why Exhibit 1 has become the most disputed element in the case. Friedman's approach is direct. He's pushing not just to exclude the evidence but to reveal everything, confident that releasing the complete recording will dismantle Lively's constructed narrative. His strategy focuses on context and chronology, proving that once the sequence of her claims unravels, so does her foundation for retaliation. In the end, Exhibit 1 has evolved from a single piece of supporting evidence into a potential turning point, one that could ultimately determine whether Blake Lively's story holds firm or collapses under the weight of its own contradictions.
The recording was taken without his consent. Regarding the declaration, plaintiff seeks to seal information regarding the timing of the meeting and the context of the conversation recorded without Sarowitz's consent. Other than the witness's name and the name of the project the declarant worked on, none of the information reveals identities. So basically the person who recorded it, I guess. Plaintiff improperly seeks to hide any context for the alleged verbal abuse, why the meeting with Mr. Sarowitz took place, when it took place, and what allegedly happened after the conversation. So apparently they're trying to avoid a bunch of context as to why this was even happening. Finally, plaintiff does not provide any explanation why Exhibit 1 to the declaration must be sealed, other than it would invite additional media coverage, which she is concerned will be adverse to her. However, it is well settled that generalized concerns of adverse publicity and reputational injury are insufficient to justify sealing records. More importantly, Lively herself is responsible for the substantial media coverage resulting from her decision to include alleged quotations from Exhibit 1, audio recording of Mr. Sarowitz. Certainly, any privacy interest belongs to Mr. Sarowitz, the person who was recorded without his consent. He should be permitted to have the public hear the entire audio recording and not be confined solely to Lively's flawed and out of context purported transcription of the audio recording. Amen, dude. Amen. Why does she always get to pick and choose what you guys get to see? But then she wants to see everything. That's why I think a lot of people didn't want to give her so much information, because they're not going to be honest about the information. They will make it whatever they want to make it. And that's what's so messed up about this whole case. It's been such a waste, so disgusting on so many.
In retaliation cases, timing is everything. It determines whether a claim stands or collapses. And right now, Blake Lively's case appears to be unraveling at that very point. The sequence of events in her narrative doesn't align, leaving cracks that are growing harder to ignore. Lively contends that she faced a smear campaign in retaliation for raising internal concerns, but there's an 8-month gap between her alleged complaint and the supposed backlash, a timeline the defense calls a fatal flaw. Jurors expect a clear cause and effect, not months of silence separating the two. According to her filings, the protected activity began early in 2024, yet the alleged retaliation didn't surface until late summer, creating what attorneys describe as a causation chasm. The problem deepens when her own public statements from that same period are introduced. She previously described the second phase of filming as smooth and stress-free, words that directly contradict her later claims of hostility and retaliation. If the production environment was calm, where was the mistreatment she now insists occurred? The defense has seized on this inconsistency, arguing that her narrative has been retrofitted to connect dots that never truly aligned. Their analogy is cutting. It's like blaming a neighbor for a storm months after they've moved away. The comparison resonates because retaliation, by definition, must follow closely after the triggering event. When 8 months of calm separate the two, doubt inevitably sets in. Was this genuine retaliation or simply a reinterpretation of normal industry tension? By emphasizing that gap, the defense aims to shift perception, turning her image from that of a victim into that of a storyteller shaping a narrative. Once the timeline falters, the entire structure of her claim weakens, because causation, the legal thread binding every allegation, begins to unravel. Even more troubling for Lively's side is the evolving nature of her account. Details about when and how the retaliation began have subtly shifted over time. That quiet reshaping of her story may prove more damaging than the delay itself, suggesting not confusion, but deliberate manipulation.
Little girl attorney, who I'm a fan of, I would love to have you on. I saw her over on Elsie's channel. I want to full shout out and props to her. I want her to explain a little bit of this weighing in this issue and how this is kind of not a good thing for Blake.
Nowhere have we seen them expressly state that the retaliation campaign, the online smear campaign, actually happened while filming. That means that the online smear campaign has to date back to 2023 through early 2024. And by Lively's own admission, there was nothing that she could say was harassing that happened on set for the phase 2 of the filming. Then she must be alleging then that there was retaliation that happened during phase 2 of the filming. And that we haven't seen any specific allegations of.
She specifically says that round 2 of shooting went smoothly and there were no problems. That's from her own lawsuit.
So that's curious, and I wonder how that's going to play out. The reason I think they're doing that is because some of us have been talking about how there is a causation issue with the amount of time that has gone by between the allegation of the alleged protected activity, which we're not 100% sure what she's alleging is a protected activity. Is it that January 4th meeting? Is it the 17-point list that was emailed in November? Is it the 30-point list that was orally discussed in the January 4th meeting? What exactly constitutes that alleged protected activity?
Great questions.
In any case, even if you take the latest one, which would have been in January 2024, she has alleged that the online smear campaign started in August or after August of 2024, which in and of itself is about 8 months of nothing, where she alleges nothing happened, no retaliation happened. I mean, she hasn't actually alleged any retaliatory acts that happened between that period of time. Now she's saying that retaliation began while filming. So are you saying that you raised the complaint in January to the Wayfarer parties, and then there was retaliation during phase 2 of the filming, when you also alleged that there was no harassment, there were no problems on set? So what was the retaliation that happened during the filming?
At what point does a story stop evolving and start contradicting itself? That's the dilemma now surrounding Blake Lively's case. In her early statements, she spoke with certainty. Filming, she said, wrapped without conflict or disruption during phase 2. It was a confident claim, clear and seemingly final. But that version has since shifted. Now, Lively suggests the retaliation she's alleging began midway through production, introducing a second, conflicting account that directly challenges her earlier narrative. The contradiction is hard to ignore. If production was smooth, how could retaliation already have been underway? Both accounts can't be true, yet both come from her own side. Even legal insiders have pointed out the inconsistency, calling it less a clarification and more an act of moving the goalposts. And that's precisely how it appears. By pushing the supposed start of retaliation back to mid-2023, Lively effectively tries to erase the damaging 8-month gap between her complaint and the alleged backlash, a gap the defense had already labeled a fatal weakness. The adjustment might patch one hole, but it opens another, because shifting timelines can read less like accuracy and more like manipulation. Judges and jurors rarely forgive that kind of revision. What once looked like a mistake begins to resemble a tactic. The fine line between evolving testimony and collapsing credibility sits right there. Every change chips away at trust. Observers in the courtroom describe this new claim as a retrofit, not a revelation, an effort to rewrite events under pressure rather than clarify them. Jurors notice those shifts instantly. They stop seeing honesty and start seeing strategy. In that light, credibility becomes her greatest vulnerability. Imagine both of her statements played back to back, one confidently describing a peaceful shoot, the other insisting retaliation was secretly unfolding during that same period. The contrast would sound like two different people telling incompatible truths. Jurors don't need legal training to recognize that disconnect, they feel it instinctively. And once that perception takes hold, every future argument from her side will face an uphill climb. This isn't just a technical inconsistency, it's a turning point that could fracture her entire case. Because when a timeline can't be trusted, neither can motive. And as the courtroom battle intensifies, one question now defines the stakes. Whose credibility collapses first, Blake Lively's, as her story starts to splinter, or Justin Baldoni's, if he uses this opening to expose her entire strategy as deliberate misdirection?
That's the problem. She's never had an idea because there wasn't any, and she's constantly fishing for it because she's trying to make one out of thin air, if we're being honest, right? That's what I really think is happening here. This is really wild that she's doing. I mean, so really process that, because this letter kind of changes things when they bring this up. 8 months after her alleged protected activity. So yeah, that January 4th meeting or the 17 list of demands, courts want to see retaliation happen pretty soon after the trigger. So 8 months, that's a causation gap that a lawyer could drive a truck through. So this joint letter sort of reveals that in a way. This during filming is really actually her attempting to move the goalposts, a total shift, dragging the timeline back to 2023, early 2024, right into filming, so she can then close the gap and make it easier to argue retaliation later. It's all a legal tactic. So as little girl attorney commented, she's admitted nothing happened during phase 2 of filming. So why? That's ridiculous that she did that. Now she's going to spin and say, oh no, it did happen during filming. But that looks like just a pivot to, help the summary judgment, et cetera, and we keep the moving stories, et cetera. But it just raises the bigger question now of like, if these facts keep changing, how solid was her story in the first place? Like, that's the real reality here, right? All of this is now questionable to me, as it always has been, I think, for a lot of us who are actually following this case as closely as we are. She has just completely bumbled so many things, and she has no idea what happened, and she's been trying to find it, but she's found nothing.
Is this case really about justice, or about who falls first in the court of public opinion? That's the question now hanging over the battle between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. What began as a legal dispute has evolved into a high-stakes power struggle, one where reputation is as valuable and as fragile as any courtroom victory. Each side faces a different kind of danger. For Lively, moving forward means exposing every contradiction in her story, from the disputed timeline and selective evidence to the controversy over Exhibit 1. Once those details are tested under cross-examination, they threaten not just her case but the credibility that underpins her career. A ruling that frames these inconsistencies as intentional rather than accidental could transform a retaliation claim into a public unraveling. Yet Baldoni isn't safe either. Simply being accused leaves a mark that no verdict can fully erase. His defense now leans on Brian Friedman's strategy, weaponizing the same audio recording Lively once used to strengthen her case. If the complete version undermines her account, it could end the lawsuit before trial, sparing him months of scrutiny and media speculation. But the fallout could also reshape everything, forcing Lively to make a critical choice: keep fighting to seal the evidence and risk appearing evasive, or release it and risk exposure. Every move carries consequence. Push too hard and she looks desperate, change her story again and she appears calculated, say nothing, and she loses control of the narrative entirely. It's a ruthless legal chess match playing out under the constant glare of cameras, with every filing, motion, and whisper magnified by the press. Should Exhibit 1 be unsealed and the contradictions revealed, the story could explode beyond the courtroom, turning Blake from a symbol of retaliation into a symbol of manipulation. Her credibility could crumble in real time while the industry watches. But beneath the headlines, the real tension isn't just over who wins, it's over what this fight represents. A case that once claimed to be about truth has become a study in power, control, and image management. That disputed audio file, allegedly recorded without consent and edited into selective fragments, now stands as a metaphor for the entire conflict: how easily fact can be sliced, shaped, and sold as truth. Critics argue that what's unfolding isn't justice at all, but theater, a public spectacle dressed in legal language, where perception triumphs over proof. And so, as both careers hang in the balance, one question lingers louder than ever: are we watching a pursuit of truth, or just another Hollywood war where winning means surviving the story?